Hey, I'm Jesse. Let's have a devotion. Our main text today is Exodus 9, verses 8 through 12. But I want to give us some prophetic context and go back and review 421 and 7:3, I think, because God's about to do something that he said that he would do. And it's going to become a theme for the next few plagues after this plague of Egypt. Here's Exodus chapter 4, verse 21. The Lord instructed Moses, when you go back to Egypt, make sure that you do before Pharaoh all the wonders that I have put within your power, but I will harden his heart so that he won't let the people go. Again, 7:3, but I will harden Pharaoh's heart and multiply my signs and wonders in the land of Egypt. So twice God has said that he's going to do this thing. And so far in each of the plagues, Pharaoh's heart has been hardened of his own volition. But in verse 12 of today's text, spoiler, you're going to see God do what he said he would do. Here's Exodus 9, verse 8. Then the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, take handfuls of furnace soot, and Moses is to throw it toward heaven in the sight of Pharaoh. These words are important because even though God is hardening Pharaoh's heart at the end of this one, Pharaoh is there to bear witness. And so he is culpable, especially for all of the instances of hard-heartedness that he's exhibited so far. Verse 9, it will become fine dust over the entire land of Egypt. It will become festering boils on people and animals throughout the land of Egypt. So they took furnace soot and stood before Pharaoh. Moses threw it toward heaven and became festering boils on people and animals. Now, this is a unique plague. This is one that affects the people directly and not indirectly. For example, turning the water into blood and killing the fish in the Nile and making it stink. That affects the Nile particularly, but then secondarily it affects the people. This time it goes straight for the people. It affects them dermatologically, topically. And it's something that God foreshadowed when Moses took his hand in and out of his cloak to show that God could afflict and God could also heal and take away. He will afflict the Egyptians. He will spare his own people. And this will be another demonstration of his sovereign favor upon his chosen people. Now, this furnace, let's talk about this briefly, because there's something to this. This wasn't any furnace. This was probably a lime kiln used for the making of bricks. And so that soot would have been plentiful. We can see that Moses takes a handful and Aaron takes a handful. And this furnace soot was a byproduct of the slavery of the Israelites. It was probably accumulating within the furnace that they used as the Israelite people were forced to make bricks and then forced to make bricks without straw. So that byproduct of the affliction of the Israelites would become the epicenter, the locus, the original source that God would miraculously use to then afflict the people of Egypt. Take a minute and consider this for a second. You can be under the authority of someone who completely disobeys God and God will take care of you. But if you're not in the Lord, then you are quite prone to becoming collateral damage as you're under the leadership of someone who is hard-hearted toward God. Because this is not just affecting Pharaoh himself. It's now affecting everyone who's under his authority who doesn't belong to the Lord. And it's not just the people, it's the animals too. This one hits close to home. This one hits people directly, but it's going to get worse. Now, verse 11, the magicians could not stand before Moses because of the boils, for the boils were on the magicians as well as on all the Egyptians. But the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he did not listen to them, as the Lord had told Moses. So here it is, the first example of the Lord hardening Pharaoh's heart. And who are you, O Pharaoh, to talk back to God? God has his will done. It is his prerogative to do this. It's amazing and gracious of God not to have done this yet. And Pharaoh has no grounds upon which to accuse God, especially because he has exhibited this exact behavior himself of his own volition over and over again anyway. You can see that God is now overriding Pharaoh's free will, and he's doing so for a purpose. He's doing so to make the glorious riches of his grace known through his chosen nation of Israel. And now he's using Egypt as a demonstration of his judgment through miraculous plagues. Now, this particular plague is going to come up later in God's covenant relationship with Israel. Not only with the Egyptians certainly never forget this plague, but the Israelites will not forget it either. They will look at God's judgment upon those who are disobedient to him, and they will know when God gives the second law, Deuteronomy. It's this reiteration of the law of God with further explanation in Deuteronomy chapter 28, that they are not totally exempt from that. Because if they disobey God, they could be subject to it. Deuteronomy 28 verses 1 through 14, God lists all these blessings that come from obeying him. And then beginning in verse 15, he says this: "But if you do not obey the Lord your God by carefully following all his commands and statutes I'm giving you today, all these curses will come and overtake you." And so there's a list of these curses. And God will evoke something pretty familiar in this passage. Here's verse 27 of Deuteronomy 28. "The Lord will afflict you with the boils of Egypt, tumors, a festering rash, and scabies from which you cannot be cured." It comes up again in verse 35. "The Lord will afflict you with painful and incurable boils in your knees and thighs, from the sole of your foot to the top of your head." So that same judgment upon Egypt would be used to discipline Israel if they disobeyed. Now, take a minute to just thank God that you were born under the new covenant era. Look at this verse, verse 11. "The magicians could not stand before Moses because of the boils." There have been moments where these guys look like they won, and then God would demonstrate his superiority. They have this contest where the staff turns into a snake, and then they seem to replicate it, but then Moses' staff turned into a snake consumes the snake from the Egyptian magicians. And we can see that these guys would come along and make things worse, replicating the miracles on a smaller scale, actually adding to the plagues of God, doing nothing to abate the plagues of God. And they seem like they're winning at times. And what you'll notice is not in the text is Moses and Aaron trying to make any kind of retributive justice on their own part to try to set these magicians in line. They don't ever even seem to engage the magicians directly. The magicians were men of power in Egypt, and they likely continued to stand by Pharaoh through the whole thing. But this is the last time you're ever going to hear about these magicians. The next time they're even mentioned in Scripture is in the New Testament, and they're given names, Jannes and Jambres, and they're examples of what not to be like. The magicians could not stand. Okay, now this could be interpreted, physically, like they physically couldn't stand because of the boils. If we use Deuteronomy 28 as a cross-reference, even though Deuteronomy 28 was written after this, we could probably assume that they probably had boils on the bottoms of their feet, so they physically could not stand. But I think it also speaks to their lack of ability to fulfill their ex officio duties. They could not stand in this courtroom setting. They couldn't stand. They couldn't stand physically. They couldn't stand, even philosophically, epistemologically. They have nothing left to stand on because they are out of power. They have been utterly outmatched, and they've been directly afflicted, and they have proven themselves not to be of God because now they are afflicted by the precise plague that God put on all the Egyptians. This is the last time we're going to hear about these guys. If you feel like the bad guys are winning in your life, would you look at Moses and Aaron? Don't go write anonymous reviews on Glassdoor about your boss. Just trust the Lord. Don't write, anonymous stuff on Yelp about your own company. Just trust the Lord. Don't try to take vengeance into your own hands, because for one thing, you may slander someone, you may commit libel against someone, and then You are culpable for your own sin before God because of what you've done. Moreover, what you do to them is nothing compared to what God would do to them. Moreover, you and I make very poor administrators of retributive justice because we have our own sin and we don't know all the details about them. Juxtapose that with God, who has no sin and knows everything about them. He is far better at this. We've got our own stuff to deal with. Trust the Lord with it. Look at Moses and Aaron and their rivalry, as it were, quote unquote, with these magicians, and look at how they just kept doing what God said to do. They kept doing what God said to do. They kept doing what God said to do. And now God has handled these magicians. So even if the bad guys look like they're winning for now, take heart and trust the Lord. There's no one greater than He. There's no one greater than God. Period. There's no one who's more worthy of worship. He's far more an important focus than your own kind of vengeance. And moreover, he is far better qualified than you or I to administer justice. Vengeance is mine, declares the Lord. Just ask Janice and John Brace.